I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of country, the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and to acknowledge the land on which we stand today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to say what a great privilege it is to be here today at the university where I studied, and also because I was present for the creation of Future Health Leaders. So it's really wonderful to be invited back here, and I particularly want to thank Shannon Knott for the invitation to speak. And what I'm speaking to you about today is about your potential, individually and collectively, to lead a strong health worker movement to change the world. And for me, in the last 30 years of human rights work, I've been guided by a sentiment that was so eloquently captured by the late Kath Walker, who later adopted her tribal name, Oodgeroo of the tribe Ngunnawal, when she said, "As I have travelled the world, I've often thought that one could judge society by the way it treats its minorities. Where a minority has been forced to live in squalor, I've seen a squalid society. Where a minority has been riddled with disease, I've seen a sick society. And where a minority has been without hope, I've seen a nation without hope." You have the power to come together as a strong health worker movement and change the frame, and then change the world. You have the power to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which holds true the right of every person on this earth to have access to healthcare, to have access to health services. And this Universal Declaration of Human Rights has most recently been affirmed by the new Global Sustainable Development Goals, to which Australia is a signatory. You have the power to be a very strong global health movement for change, and to change the world in the way that Margaret Mead said when she reflected, "Never doubt that a small group of committed, thoughtful citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." For me, a tipping point moment of change happened some 15 years ago when I spent a day with Nelson Mandela. And he was in Sydney at the time to speak at an event called What Makes a Champion. And I was leading one of the Olympic media centres for the Olympic Games. And I was approached about whether I would be prepared to look after Mr. Mandela for a day. You can imagine, would you mind looking after Mr. Mandela? Oh, well, okay. And so during the course of the day, he said to me, "Jane, if you really want to make a positive difference in the world, you should focus on conflict resolution and citizen-led change." If you think about the wisdom of those words, since all the conflict that's happened since and the number of people-led movements that have risen up around the world, you just again reflect on what an incredible individual Nelson Mandela was. And so from that point really to now, I've been on quite a journey, and that journey has led me to working with an organisation called Global Fund for Women. Global Fund for Women was created some 27 years ago by 3 women who were concerned about the fact that there wasn't much money going to support women-led organisations in developing countries, and the money that was going to support them was largely project-based, rather than core funding to be able to sustain the advocacy and the activism. And they wanted to change all that. Well, since that time, we've given out about $120 million to some 5,000 women's groups. And just to give you an idea of what that means in practice, and the radical idea of trusting women and getting money into the hands of women in order to see transformative change. 3 of the women who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011 were early recipients of funding from Global Fund for Women. One of those women, Laima Gabawi from Liberia, had a dream to end the Liberian Civil War. And so she used some of the money that we provided to bus hundreds of women into Accra in Ghana, where the male leaders of the Liberian Civil War were meeting. And these women surrounded the compound, and Laima Gabawi grabbed a megaphone, and she said, "We women, we're tired of war. We want peace. We want justice. And we are surrounding this compound, and we're not going to let you men out until you make a decision to end the civil war. And if you try and come out, we're going to bare our breasts, which is like a hex on men. And so those men stayed in that compound for several days until they finally did make a decision to end the civil war. And when they came out, Lama Gabawi and the other women, they turned their attention to getting the first female president of Liberia elected. And that woman, of course, was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. One of our board members at the time, Abby Disney, who's the granddaughter of Walt Disney, was so transfixed by this story that she made a film about Lama Gabawi and the women who surrounded the compound. That film was called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And at the same time, Tina Brown, that legendary publisher in New York, approached Lama Gabawi about writing a book about her experiences. And it was that book and that film that came to the attention of the Nobel Peace Prize Organising Committee. And that was really what helped get her the recognition that she deserved. That's what happens when you not only get money into the hands of women's groups, but when you lift up their voices and their views so the whole world knows what they're capable of achieving. Just one other example of an incredible movement for change closer to home, a woman called Janet Sape here. She was concerned about the fact that in Papua New Guinea, some 83% of women experience some form of domestic violence. Many of these women in rural and remote parts of the country can't access their own bank account without getting their husband's signature. And so it means that they're trapped in a cycle of violence and they can't get out of that, can't imagine a different life or economic independence. So Janet had a dream. She had a banking background before she went back to working in her community. She had a dream to create a Pacific Women's Bank, and we provided her the funding to be able to pursue that dream. And so she worked with thousands of women. She managed to get some 15,000 signatures from women who really wanted to see this bank happen. The problem was she couldn't get the banking license from the Prime Minister. And so I'm also on the board of a Women's Funding Network in the United States, and we have an award called the LEAD Award, which is a Global Women's Leadership Award. And so Global Fund for Women flew Janet Sape to the United States to receive this award, and she stood up before hundreds of men and women at a global women's conference, and she said, you know, we women in Papua New Guinea, we thought we were alone. We thought our problems were our own. And what I realised standing before you today is we have a whole global women's community, a whole movement that has our back. And I can't tell you what a difference that makes. We then beamed the footage of Janet receiving that award back to Papua New Guinea, back to TV stations in the country, to newspapers in the country. So by the time she arrived back in Papua New Guinea, she was a rock star. She was on the front page of the papers. She was the lead story in the TV news. And so sometime after she arrived back, the Prime Minister invited her to his residence and he signed over that banking licence to her. And now, some 2 years later, she has over 30,000 women who have signed up as members of that bank. That's what happens when you not only get money into the hands of a group that wants to lead a strong movement for change, but you also lift up their voices and their views. That's what's really important about the way that we work. We don't just invest in individual people, in individual leaders. We don't even invest in individual groups. We invest in strong social movements, believing that that's the best way to be able to change the world. And we take our cue from an activist scholar called Srilatha Batlawala, who defined a social movement as an organised set of people interested in making a change in their situation by pursuing a common political agenda through collective action. And that common political agenda is really critical in terms of the level of change you're able to achieve. And so why are social movements important? Well, research has shown that broad-based social movements are one of the most effective mechanisms to create and to sustain long-term social transformation. So, for example, social movements have been pivotal in the adoption of progressive policies, in ensuring policy implementation, in changing a whole political process, in changing gender norms. So one example of this, you'll remember the woman in India who was raped, that horrific rape on a bus, and the global outrage that resulted from that. And the fact that the Indian government then, less than 2 months later, passed new laws to give new protection to women and girls in terms of sexual violence and domestic violence. Well, those laws were only made possible by the years of work by women's social movements, women's groups that were writing policies, drafting legislation, working together to create the kind of environment that could ensure that when this political tipping point moment occurred, everything was ready and able to enact the change into law. So all of that work of investing in movements for change is vitally important for when those tipping point moments occur. So what does a strong social movement look like? Well, one example of that is the movement for climate justice. And here, a health worker movement has a pivotal role to play with the intersection of climate justice. So, for example, the World Health Organization has predicted that in the years ahead, in Papua New Guinea alone, it's likely to face a 95% exposure to malaria. So you can imagine the level of disease and dislocation that will follow in Papua New Guinea in other Pacific countries that are on our doorstep. And we'll see a lot more climate change refugees as a result of rising sea levels and all of the other factors that play a part with climate change. We've already seen that in the Carteret Islands with members of the population moving to Bougainville. We're likely to see a whole lot more in the time ahead. And you, as a health worker movement, are going to really be at the front line of response. It's also really important to pay attention to the gender dimensions of climate change, of health worker response. So, for example, during the Asian tsunami, you may not know this, for every man and boy who died, 3 women and girls died, often for cultural reasons, such as women not feeling that they could leave their homes because they didn't have their husband's permission, or they didn't feel that they were covered up enough, or because they didn't know how to swim. So paying attention to those factors, paying attention to what's playing out in the world with climate change is really critical, and connecting with that movement is really vital as well. And to that point, the key components of a strong movement include that connectivity with other movements. It includes having a strong leadership pipeline and diverse leadership so that you're actually reflecting the diverse perspectives within a movement. It requires a strong grassroots base, and it requires a strong organising structure. It requires the use of multiple strategies, which includes convening, such as this, capacity building, outreach, surveys, research, advocacy, the use of social media. It requires a collective political agenda, an agenda that has a focus on shifting power as much as shifting resources. And it requires strong alliances, not just with established movements, but also with emerging movements. And one of those emerging movements is the movement to end hypermasculinity. And this image you see here is from a film that some of you might have seen. It's a film that was created by a US filmmaker called Jennifer Siebel Newsom, called The Mask You Live In. And she conducted interviews with boys and young men in the United States, asking questions such as, what does it mean to be a man? What do you think about when you're told to man up? What does masculinity mean to you in your lives? And it's really an absolutely incredible film. I'd love to see a similar film made in Australia, interviews with Australian boys and Australian young men. It would be so interesting to see the differences and the similarities in the responses received. A couple of months ago, I was in Uganda visiting a group that we'd funded about 3 years earlier. And this group was led by a woman who was really concerned about the high number of girl kidnappings, the high rate of child marriage, the high rate of violence against women within the villages where she lived. And she started a campaign. She started going out and talking to chiefs, male chiefs, talking to police chiefs, talking to elders within the villages, talking to families about imagining a different way of life where men could drop their focus on violence, could actually imagine the deep healing that needed to occur within these villages. And she was soon joined by a young male teacher who was really distressed by the fact that his mother was being beaten up every day by his father, that his sister had been disappeared some 2 years earlier. And he also wanted to see a big change in the villages and the community. Well, I was arriving 3 years later after they'd been doing this work for some time. And I was present for the testimony that a lot of male chiefs stood up and spoke to me about. One older man said to me, you know, I used to see sex like a cup of tea, that I could have it at any time, that I could have sex with any young woman, with any girl. I'd even have sex with my daughter-in-law to test the dowry we provided, to see whether it was actually worthwhile. And that was my way of life. And I realised that it was doing as much damage to me as it was the women in my community. Man after man stood up and talked about the changes that they'd made in their own lives and now being mentors to other boys and young men in their communities. And these men, as well as the women in the community, started talking to me about the difference that this had made, that they'd now created their own cooperative dairy, they'd created their own cooperative coffee collective, that they'd created a system to be able to transport women with high-risk pregnancies to the nearest villages, that now every girl was going to school, that the kidnappings that occurred with many children on the way to school had ceased, and every boy had made their own compact to not be violent. And they said, we now want to lead a strong movement across the rest of Uganda. We want more funding because we've seen the healing that has occurred in this community. We've seen the healing that occurs when we address hypermasculinity. We now believe that we can engage communities across the rest of Uganda and create the deep level of healing that's needed to be able to transform our communities and transform the society in which we live. You have an enormously powerful role to play as health workers and health professionals to also engage in this movement to end hypermasculinity. You also have a phenomenally powerful role to play in one of the most challenging issues of our time that we're seeing playing out now, and that is the mass migration that's occurring across Europe, that's occurring across many other parts of the world because of the heightened level of war and conflict that's occurring. Mass migration needs a global health system. And I want to share with you what I've experienced in several of the Syrian refugee camps where I've been in Lebanon in recent weeks. And if you can imagine some 25,000 to 37,000 people crammed into a space of less than a kilometre. These people are living in places where there are live electrical wires just above, just a couple of feet above me. And every couple of weeks, someone else gets electrocuted from these electric wires, where any drinking water has to be brought into the camps in order for people to be able to drink, where the Lebanese government has banned some 70 occupations. So it means people in these camps have to resort to the most menial kind of work, working with the sewages, working in plumbing, where the women who are pregnant have no access to health care, where many of them are giving birth to children, to babies with deformities, and because they have no access to health treatment, these babies are being medicated and really left in a vegetative state at the moment, where the level of violence that is an all-time high, and where the women, particularly Syrian women, have just normalised the violence. Some of them said to me, we think it's better that our husbands hit us, beat us up, rather than them hitting others, rather than them beating up others. Where children are encouraged to scream so that they're not grabbed and taken away from the camps and sold off to some of the Gulf men in Gulf communities. And this is something that's not normal for Syrian children. They're not normally taught to scream, so they've had to change their behaviour and to be able to scream when any man touches them. Where the women's groups that we're supporting have been working with Syrian women to really understand that they have rights, that they have the right to not be violated in their community, and also, again, working with men so that they can deal with the level of trauma that they're facing and understand what's driving them to be violent every day. One of the young boys I spoke with in the community, who was also a victim of domestic violence, I asked him, "What would you like to be when you grow up?" And he said to me, "I'd like to be a pilot so I can fly away from all of this." You know, these stories are just absolutely heartbreaking of what's happening in these camps. These people have the right to a different life. They have the right to basic health care, to be able to support them, to be able to imagine a different life in the time ahead. Because if we don't support these people, we're going to not only deny them their basic human rights, we're going to be able to, I guess, lead them to a situation that none of them want to be able to see, which is being led into the arms of armed groups, not just ISIS, but other armed groups. They want to take the first ticket out of there to be able to get themselves out of this situation. Because the level of poverty, the level of disease, the level of despair in these camps is something that no one should ever have to experience. The problem is this is just the beginning. What I've experienced and witnessed is just the beginning of a great tide of humanity that is pouring into these camps at the moment. You have the power to come together as a global health worker movement and advocate for change, advocate for the right of these people to be able to assume the need and the access to basic health care. Because healthcare is a human right. Healthcare is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you have the power to be able to change this situation. You have the power to change the world. And in this respect, technology is going to play a massively important role. The power of a mobile phone to be able to change the situation for an individual and a community. The ability of a phone to be able to determine and detect a high-risk pregnancy and for a woman to be able to get the health care that she needs so that her baby is saved. The power of a phone to be able to support girls and women who are in high areas of conflict, such as happened in Haiti, where women devised a 24-hour hotline using cell phones so that girls and young women who were in danger could immediately use their cell phones to be able to get to safety and to identify where they could get help if they'd been raped or abused. When I spent time with Syrian and Iraqi women activists a few weeks ago in Turkey, they said to me that one of the most important things that would help them in organising an underground network to keep girls and women safe from ISIS was a safe digital network so that they could identify where women were at risk, where they could set up safe shelters, where they could dismantle where they needed to be able to get out of a space quickly. So the power of technology to be able to keep girls and women safe, to keep boys and men safe, and to be able to provide the services that are needed to be able to drive a strong health worker movement. How we use our power is really going to determine our world. How you use your power and the choices that you make in the time ahead. How you use your decision-making and how you make a commitment to a strong global health worker movement is really going to shape our world for the time ahead. You have the power here today to be able to change the world. Please join me in this strong vision to be able to change not only the experiences that I've seen in the Syrian refugee camps, but the experience for every individual in the world. You have the power to drive a strong global health worker movement. You have the power to change the world. I invite you to step up and assume that challenge. Thank you very much.